On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, what the ship is going on in the Red Sea? I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. So, about every week or two, we do a long form episode where we look at 5 stories entitled What the Ship. And this week, I figured we would sit here and focus on what is happening, not just in the Red Sea, but let's get out of the Red Sea a bit and look at the global implications of the situation. One of the things we do in this channel is talk about how shipping impacts you, the consumer, the shipper, basically anyone who deals with global shipping. And by the way, that's every single person on the planet. So today we're going to look at 5 stories about this. We're going to recap the situation going on in the Red Sea. We're going to talk about the diversions, what's happening with ships that are avoiding this region. We're going to talk about the Panama Canal and the role it plays in this event. We're going to talk about the costs associated with this and a myriad of smaller issues. All of them are impacting global shipping today. If you're new to the channel, hey, take a moment, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. All right, we're going to use our buddies over at Marine Traffic's app here to give you a picture of ocean shipping. Now, every ship broadcasts what's called an AIS, an Automated Information System Transponder. I have cleaned up this map, so this is showing you all cargo ships in green and tankers in red over 10,000 gross tons. That's a fairly good ocean-going commerce-sized vessel. And you will see a couple of things that really should stand out for you. So number one, is the amount of ships and the movement of them around the world. Obviously, East Asia, you see that massive kind of grouping of ships over here. They come through the South China Sea, through the Singapore Straits, out of the Straits of Malacca, and then they branch. You'll see a solid branch coming down here to South Africa. This is a much larger branch than usual because of the diversions. You'll notice it's mainly green and cargo ships. These are usually bulk tankers, bulk carriers coming down. You don't typically see a lot of container ships coming down this route, but right now that's exactly what we're seeing. And notice how the red branches off here, with the red going either up into the Persian Gulf or heading here into the Gulf of Aden through the Bab el-Mandeb. This is the region right here where the Houthi are attacking, and then up here to the Suez Canal, out into the Mediterranean, up either into the Black Sea or through the Straits of Gibraltar up to Northern Europe. But you also notice this branch down here, the southern tip of South Africa. And then you see all this trade coming into that region. And then it branches itself with a large group heading to the east coast of Brazil, another branch heading to the northern coast of South America, heading up toward the United States, particularly the Gulf of Mexico, and then another branch heading northward at this time. So this gives you a good overview of what is exactly happening with shipping. This is zooming into the Bab el-Mandeb. You'll see right here, this is the Red Sea. Here's the Bab el-Mandeb. This is the narrow little strait between Yemen here and Djibouti and Eritrea. The Houthi are stationed right here. They have their foothold on the western side of Yemen, so we've seen lots of attacks up and down this area. Notice there is traffic still going through. Trade has not been entirely disrupted, but you'll see exactly what trade has been disrupted here in a moment. So I now reset marine traffic to just show you container ships over 8,000 TEUs. TEUs is 20-foot equivalent units. And you'll see that the vast majority of container ships now are heading on this southern route. You don't see but just a handful here coming into the Gulf of Aden and then right here into the area of the Red Sea. And there's a reason for that, and we'll talk about why we're seeing ships starting to come back into this region right now. But the vast majority of container ships have diverted. You'll see them coming through here through the Mozambique Channel. These are ones that were heading for the Suez Canal and the Red Sea. They've diverted down. Most of the ships now are taking that left coming out of the very top end here of the Straits of Malacca and are heading for the southern tip here of South Africa. And then you'll see a vast fleet of vessels, a lot of them coming out of the Mediterranean now, heading down along the western side of Africa, heading for the southern tip of Africa. This image shows you bulk carriers. These are ships that carry coal, grain, ore of any type. You'll see the vast majority of bulk carriers are on this route heading around the southern tip of South Africa. That was the norm beforehand, but you still have a lot of bulk carriers that are coming through the Bab el-Mandeb into the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden. So that trade has not been disrupted terribly by the attacks by the Houthi. This shows you crude oil tankers. And again, you're still seeing that pretty dense crude oil tanker routes, fairly solid, coming out of the Persian Gulf, heading either to Asia or branching off and heading towards Europe through the Suez. So we haven't seen the big diversion coming of crude oil. And if you look coming out of the Mediterranean here in the Black Sea, this is that Russian crude oil that's coming out here. And you can see it's still flowing pretty well at this time through the region. Haven't been a lot of disruptions in that area. If you look at product tankers, these are tankers that carry gasoline and diesel, basically refined, clean product. You'll see pretty barren in the Red Sea and the Suez at this time. So a lot of shippers are not taking their clean product tankers through this region. Last I'll show you is LNG, liquefied natural gas, and liquefied petroleum gas tankers. Still see some coming through, not as many as usual. A lot of them are heading for that Southern Africa route. And the real big thing you're seeing here is a shift in pattern. So a lot of LPG, LNG tankers coming out of the Gulf Coast of the United States, heading either through the Panama Canal, and we'll talk about that, or heading eastward across the Atlantic to supply Europe. LNG, LPG tankers also come out of Qatar in the Middle East and from Australia, and you'll see a lot of those routes going that way. So let's jump into story number one, the update on what is happening right now. So the latest, as of December 23rd, 2023, is an Israeli-linked vessel was struck by a drone out in the middle of the Arabian Sea. Now, this is far away from the Bab el-Mandeb and even the areas where we saw some previous. You have to basically go out pretty far here. So this is an area between the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula and India. Now, this ship is linked to Israel. We know it got struck by a drone. However, there is no significant damage that we know of to the ship, and no one in the crew has been hurt. However, it is significant that this ship was hit. Way back at the beginning of this, there was an Israeli-linked ship, the CMA CGM Sphinx, that was hit by what was believed to be an Iranian drone at the time. Remember, there was a bulk carrier, Maltese flag, Bulgarian-owned, Ruan, that is now sitting there off the coast of Somalia. And I tend to think the reason for a strike like this is to try to distract from the ongoing military presence that is off the coast of Yemen right now. By striking a ship this far out, you're trying to pull naval forces away from the area in and around the Bab el-Mandeb. And so this, I think, is a significant move right now. It is probably being done by Iran. Hard to believe the Houthi are out there doing this far, but to grab that Bulgarian-owned bulker, you probably needed a mothership out there, and you can launch these types of drones from motherships. So definitely a big escalation that we're seeing right now in the scope and scale of the events. This story from Reuters: White House accuses Iran of helping Houthi target ships. Well, in the most obvious statement coming from a White House in a long time, can I just say, duh. No fooling. This is not surprising. We know Iran has been supporting the Houthi. There's no question about that. The stuff they're using is from Iran. I mean, we know there's Iranian ships and planes flying into Houthi territory. They're using Iranian equipment. Yeah, the Iranians are helping the Houthi. We know this. I'm not exactly sure why this is a huge revelation. This one from Lloyd's List: Red Sea security in limbo as shipping awaits detail of naval operations. Now, this is starting to clear up, and I'm going to talk about this. This is kind of an unfolding. This is from 2 days ago. This is Richard Meade talking about the fact that the details of Operation Prosperity Guardian, the plan of how to execute this operation, has been unfolding. And this has been a very interesting story of how this operation is being done. So you get this story from Reuters: Spain, Italy, France decline U.S. command of Red Sea Operation Prosperity Guardian. So you had the announcement from the United States. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin, while he's in the Mideast, made the announcement of Operation Prosperity Guardian. This was going to be done under the auspices of Combined Task Force 153, part of the Combined Maritime Forces of the U.S. Fifth Fleet under Central Command in Bahrain. However, as this story unfolded, what we started to hear was, man, there is not a lot of support coming in. You know, nations were offering staff. Some countries were offering ships, but then we heard specifically that some nations were upset with how long it was taking for the U.S. to initiate this operation. And therefore, what we heard and what was reported by both me and other sources, Reuters, G-Captain, and a few others, was that nations were basically saying, listen, we're going to do this on our own. And we're going to talk about the French here in a second. This has been evolving, I should say, and this story by John Conrad kind of follows suit with this. The French Navy began an escort operation of their own ships because they were not waiting for this. I reported this in an earlier video, and we discussed this, that the French initiated escorts through the Bab el-Mandeb. They took the CMA CGM Aqaba through. They escorted the CMA CGM Pegasus out of Djibouti, and now they're in the process of escorting 2 vessels through the straits as we're speaking. And what we've seen now is a follow-up to this. So the first update that they had in this story, France has agreed to remain, but under the condition they do not have to follow American orders. They declined to comment on deploying more naval forces. Spain and Italy both left. So France is back, but France has the right to not listen to the United States and to leave when they want. Okay. Doesn't sound like they're really 100% back in, but they're there. Second, there's an update on a possible movement of U.S. flagships behind a French naval convoy. Okay, I am not going to give you information right now because this is ongoing. I am not going to endanger merchant mariners with giving you real-time data. I will provide a video later on once everybody's through and talk about this, but I have been talking about the fact that U.S. ships have been sitting in the Red Sea and the Gulf of Oman for a while. It is the French who, using a FREM frigate, this is the same type of frigate, by the way, that we're building right now up in Wisconsin, but it's going to take years for us to get this thing up and running, the Constellation class. They're using this frigate to escort their vessels through. Now the U.S. is just starting this operation as we speak. And this goes to the issue of the choices that the two sides are taking. The U.S. is leading this operation, Operation Prosperity Guardian, but everybody's kind of concerned with being attached to the United States and how the United States will react to this. Because understand, the backdrop of this entire event, and I don't say this enough, and I understand that, and it comes up in the comments all the time, the reason the Houthi are attacking commercial ships has to do with their support with the Palestinians in Gaza, where they're being, where the invasion is going on by the Israelis after Hamas executed a series of brutal attacks against civilians and seized people and killed innocent people. So there's this brutal attack going on between Israel and Hamas right now in the Gaza Strip. The Houthi have come out on the side of the Palestinians and Hamas, and they can't really directly help them, so they're targeting commercial ships. Initially, the Houthi said they were targeting Israeli ships, but then they started attacking ships that had nothing to do with Israel. And I can prove it over and over again how many ships they've hit that are not connected to Israel, either through ownership or sailing to them. They just basically started firing at any ship sailing by. And that was what triggered this response. However, the fear that a lot of the allies have is that the way you end the Houthi attacks is by hitting the Houthi. And I don't think anybody wants to get attached to strikes in the region. That's why you heard General Pat Ryder, Major General Pat Ryder, U.S. Air Force, the Pentagon spokesman, came out. Greg Miller talks about in this story that the U.S.-led force in the Red Sea will be defensive. It will be a highway patrol, kind of patrolling up and down off the coast. Highway patrol is kind of defensive. You're not really trying to stop things from happening. You're reacting to incidents happening. And that's the problem here, is that the U.S. force is going to be a reactive force. And it's been reactive the whole time. You saw that with the Carney and with all the shootdowns that were taking place. They're not being proactive. However, I do want to raise this issue just a little bit, because over in Lloyd's List, Declan Bush wrote this piece: shipping protectors face exquisite dilemma in the Red Sea. Shooting back at the Houthi could make it worse. So a lot of people, when I put up these videos and the posts, will say we should slam the Houthis. We should, do what we did to the Barbary pirates. Well, if you study the Barbary pirates, initially what we did was very defensive against the Barbary pirates. It wasn't until much later in the conflict that we got offensive, years in, as a matter of fact. But in this case, one of the things that you have to be careful about is if you start going kinetic, if you start using weapons and warheads and hitting the Houthi, that's going to open up a can of worms. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of the Europeans, in particularly, are backing away. I understand Europeans have a big Arab Palestinian population in their countries, and they're very worried about choosing sides between Israel and the Palestinians. No one likes Hamas because of the terrorism that they've executed. But there's a lot of sympathy for the Palestinians who are being targeted in these attacks with the civilians being killed. And so this creates the big dilemma. The way the U.S. has done this, and this is from Skits Intel over on Twitter, great updates he does. There's a whole batch of people over on Twitter doing fantastic jobs with updating. He's got this map he updates fairly daily showing military presence. And the thing to note is right down here, right in the Gulf of Aden, is the USS Eisenhower battle group. Now, we know it's there because it's been caught on satellite. It is sitting right here. It's got the USS Philippine Sea, a cruiser between Yemen and it as a safeguard. And it has about half a dozen destroyers in and around this area patrolling. And one of the things that was noted in General Ryder's speech or his press conference was there's been no attacks since the U.S. initiated Operation Prosperity Guardian. What Prosperity Guardian really appears to be is a show of force. They've moved one of two aircraft carriers, the other being the Ford up here in the Mediterranean, into the area. And I am going to imagine, I can't prove this because I don't know this, but they're flying huge air operations in and around this area so that if any Houthi fires a missile, they're going to be identified almost immediately. And I would imagine they would be terrified for an F-18 coming down on top of them and blowing up their launcher and themselves in the process. And that's probably why we haven't seen any attacks. It's also probably why the U.S. Navy hadn't moved those commercial U.S. flag ships that were sitting here in the Red Sea or the Gulf of Oman. They were waiting for an overwhelming display of force to move them. The problem with that, which is great, don't get me wrong, it's fantastic, it's great. The problem with that is you're not going to be able to maintain this overwhelming level of force for a long period of time. This carrier is going to eventually have to leave. And matter of fact, it was scheduled to replace the Ford up in the Mediterranean. And the Eisenhower is going to have to be in three different areas. It's going to have to be in the Persian Gulf, over here in the Gulf of Aden and the Bab el-Mandeb, or over in the Eastern Med. This is hard for the U.S. to do. The U.S. cannot maintain carrier presence 24/7 in specific areas. It takes at least three carriers to do that. And if you don't have three carriers to do it, that's a problem. So it appears right now they're trying to use the overwhelming appearance of force to kind of cull the Houthi back down, resume trade through it. And what we see right now going on as we speak is a convoy by the French of French-owned vessels. And at the same time, the U.S. is moving forces or moving U.S. flagships through the area. But let's be clear, some U.S. ships have turned around. The Liberty went back through the Suez. Maersk Chicago is heading around down the southern tip of Africa right now. So it has taken time for the U.S. to do this. And this is a level of force that I don't think can be maintained for a very long period of time. All right, story number 2. Let's talk about diversions and what is happening. Now, understand, there are still container ships moving through the Suez. When you went back to that marine traffic map I had, you'll notice that there were ships sitting up here in the Red Sea and some here in the Arabian Sea. And what seems to be happening is this, that some carriers are going to send some vessels through this region still, but probably high priority vessels. We're going to come to cost and what this means in the future. But right now, they're just trying to prove it. So you're seeing right now the French bringing a pair of their vessels through. You're seeing the U.S. bringing some of these vessels of Maersk Lines Limited, of Waterman Steamship through the region. And we still are seeing vessels. Now, some of these vessels, I should note, are coming through the Suez, landing here along the the west coast of Saudi Arabia, at Jeddah and a few other ports here, offloading and then going back through the Suez. And what we're seeing is surcharges for this additional Suez Canal voyage happening. And then from there, overland either to the Persian Gulf or down over to the Gulf states. So we are still seeing carriers coming through, but at a much lower number. There are regional feeder ships. These are ships smaller than 8,000 TEUs. A lot of these are owned by shipping firms within the area, the UAE and a few other countries. They are still moving cargo through here. But the big thing here, as John Conrad notes over G Captain, we're seeing those Red Sea ripples, prolonged voyages, soaring fuel costs, and escalating carbon emissions, all creating concern. Understand, all three of those, I think, are really important because they have issues. So the prolonged voyages, we'll talk a little bit more about costs here in a minute, but suffice it to say that if you don't go through the Suez Canal and you make the long, prolonged trip around Africa, it's more expensive and you're going to be paying more for that. Add to it the soaring fuel costs. You're going to be using more fuel, more either high sulfur diesel fuel or low sulfur diesel fuel. Back in 2020, the International Maritime Organization mandated that if your ship is not fitted with what's called a scrubber, it scrubs the sulfur from your exhaust, you have to burn low sulfur fuel oil. If you have a scrubber, you can use the high sulfur fuel oil, which is better because it's cheaper. But the other issue that happened starting in 2023 was you have to monitor your carbon emissions and you have to document how much carbon emissions you're doing. And you actually have a chart you do on your carbon emissions. And so the question here is you just can't put the hammer down, put your foot on the throttle and off you go faster to make things up because you're going to be spitting out more carbon emissions. One of the things that the container lines have been doing is because they have excess ships and a lot of capacity is they have slowed down their ships. They're doing what's called slow steaming. Instead of doing 18 to 20 knots, they're doing 12 to 14 knots. Well, now if you got to sail an extra 3,500 nautical miles around Africa, that's going to take a long time at 12 knots. And so we're seeing some ships up the speed, which means they're going to have to offset that later on by slowing down, or you got to put more ships on the voyage. And all of that is associating with more costs. Maersk has already announced their schedule for going around the Cape of Good Hope. Matter of fact, they have put out their schedule through February. And to me, this is very significant because January 1 is when the ocean carriers renegotiate the new rates between Europe and Asia. So think about that for a second. You've got to renegotiate new rates. We're going to talk about this when we talk about costs. And here's the Maersk schedule through February. They're already rerouting ships. So what that means is they're putting their ships on a long-term detour around Africa. Whereas if tomorrow it looks like the Houthi are defeated and things are open, I'm not 100% sure that ships return back to that route immediately. Because if you watch the interview with the CEO of Maersk on MSNBC, or it was Bloomberg, he talked about how the safety of his mariners is a priority, which sounds great. It's a great soundbite, and it looks really good when you're out there talking. But Vincent Clerc should, we also know that in truth, money is the key, and money is the thing that's driving a lot of this. Rob Wilmington over at Lloyd's put this: more Asia-bound box ships U-turn in the Red Sea as shippers count the cost of the Cape Hope Good diversions. All these ships are turning around. Meanwhile, there are some ships sitting there. ONE has got a couple of ships, including the infamous ONE Apis that lost all its containers a few years ago, sitting there waiting to see which route they're going to go. And so all this means that while we're seeing these diversions take place, the big issue right now is whether or not we're going to see high priority diversion or high priority cargo start going through this. If you remember back to the supply chain crisis, when we saw those massive freight rates go through, and some of the spot rates were as high as $25,000, and that was an aberration. Most freight rate was nowhere near that. We're talking about 10,000 to 15,000 was the norm, but you could book your cargo in like these diamond routes that would get you to bump ahead of the line. And it looks like that some of these shippers, I will almost guarantee you, will have some ships going through this area, ensuring they have escort to go through the area, and you're going to pay more to avoid that long voyage around Africa. I can almost guarantee that. All right, let's go ahead and jump over to story number 3. Story number 3, let's talk about canals, both Suez and Panama. So if you're a follower of this channel, you know how this channel came about, and that had to do with the grounding of the Ever Given in the Suez way back in March of 2021. I mean, if you look above there, that's our image here is Ever Given sideways in the Suez, taken from the bridge of Maersk Denver. That event had huge ramifications. It caused a massive disruption in the global supply chain, but it was 6 days. It was March 23rd to March 29th of 2021. And once it cleared, the backlog cleared. But it took months to settle out what the disruption has caused. This is worse than Ever Given ever was. Let me be clear about that. Even though you still have traffic going through the Suez, this disruption is huge. And for the Egyptians, this represents a big problem. It's one of the reasons why you heard Egypt join in on Operation Prosperity Guardian, is because they're losing $500,000 per ship not coming through the Suez Canal. Understand, they expanded the Suez Canal in 2015. The plan for the Suez was to go from 50 ships a day going through up to 90. It generates $9 billion for Egypt every year. And now all of a sudden, if ships are not using the Suez at its full capacity, that means lost revenue for the Egyptians. So for the Egyptians, opening up this region is absolutely crucial. They've also undertaken some expansion. They were trying to widen the canal to prevent something like Ever Given from ever happening again. And that was being funded by the tolls coming through. And now all of a sudden, you're not seeing that level of tolls. The Suez Canal was slated to increase the rate to go through the canal by 15%. So your $500,000 going through would be almost $600,000 to go through. So they were looking to get more money coming through. So the Houthi are costing the Egyptians a lot of money at this point, and it's one of the reasons why you hear them participating in this. The other canal that's really important is the Panama Canal. And the Panama Canal is suffering from abnormally low water. This is a story we followed extensively here at What's Going On with Shipping. We've been talking about this for a long time, long before I got onto the mainstream. This is an issue that has been plaguing the issue because during the wet season, Panama was not getting water. And understand, the way the canal works is it is fed by a freshwater lake in the middle of the locks. There are 3 sets of locks on the Atlantic side. There are 3 sets of locks on the Pacific side. And basically, you take water from the lake to raise the level of the canal, or when you pump out the locks, that water flows into the Atlantic or the Pacific. The new lane of the Panama Canal that opened in 2016, you reclaim about 50% of that water. But for the older locks, you don't reclaim any of it. And understand, the yearly usage of Gatun Lake, about 50% of that is due to the Panama Canal. You can't use salt water because it's a freshwater lake. It maintains the drinking water for Panama. It's also ecological. It provides irrigation. It provides sustenance for everything. You can't just replace Gatun Lake with a saltwater lake. It doesn't work that way. You can't pump the Atlantic and the Pacific into Gatun Lake. And the impact on the lake being low is manifested itself over the past couple of months. If you look at the changes in ships going through, we've seen a substantial change. In October, 1,000 ships went through. In November, 783. That's a 21.9% drop in the number of ships coming through. And that represents a substantial problem. Fix that a little for you to see it. And if you look at the ships that are doing this, so you have 3 sets of lock, or three channels going through the Panama Canal, excuse me. You have the 2 original sets. This is the ones built back in 1914. These are the original Panamax locks. And then you have the new lane, what's called Neo-Panamax. And Neo-Panamax is really a crucial one here. You'll see right here, container ships are down 19%, liquefied petroleum carriers down 34%, and LNG, liquefied natural gas carriers, 25%, total of 27.8%. The new lane carries much bigger ships. So previously, if you took a container ship through the old Panama Canal locks, you could maybe carry about 4,500 boxes. The new lane, you can carry up to 15,000, 16,000 boxes. And a lot of these LPG, LNG tankers are going to Asia, to South Korea, to Japan, and to China. And if they can't go that way, and if you can't bring your large Panamax container ships through that way, then what we're seeing is a lot of the ocean carriers are diverting their ships from not going down to the Panama Canal, but sailing from the Gulf and East Coast, and they're heading through the Suez Canal. Well, now we've got problems to get through the Suez Canal because of the situation with the Houthis in the Bab el-Mandeb. Well, Panama Canal just announced that they're actually changing things just a bit. So you have passage through of about 36 ships a day. They went down to as low as 20 ships a day. The plan was actually to hit down to 18 slots in February, but they recently got a little bit of rain. And this is great because this is going to allow them to increase their transits up to 24 ships in January. However, you still have issues associated here with how much you can carry in the large Neo-Panamax lane. You can't carry all the way down to the full markings that you typically do. And what we're seeing is the container carriers are jumping in on this. So CMA CGM just announced a new Panama Canal surcharge. So if you want to go through the Panama Canal on a CMA CGM ship, you have to pay a surcharge on top of what you're paying. And again, this is not unusual. You're seeing about $150 per TEU, 20-foot equivalent unit, per day to get through. And this is something that the ocean carriers will do. They will pass on to you, because of their shipping agreements, all associated costs. And that's exactly what you're seeing. This is from John McCowan over in the Blue Alpha Group. So one of the things John does is track imports, exports of containers into U.S. ports. And this chart he does shows you West Coast as a percentage of total inbound volume. Back in 2017, we saw the trend here of shifting from cargo coming from Asia into West Coast ports, shifting over to East Coast ports. 2017 coincides with the opening of the new lane in the canal in 2016. And you can see how much it is, so much so that by 2022, it was under 50% and the downward trend is going. But notice now it is kicking back up again. And LA and Long Beach, who had all the problems during the supply chain crisis, which, by the way, they haven't solved yet, it's still there, but they had less cargo coming into them, are now seeing a resurgence in cargo heading their way. If you look at the import volumes here, number of containers for November, you'll notice that for East Coast and Gulf Coast, they're down compared to West Coast. And that's a big change. Now you see they're up. Their November percentage change is up 24.5%. If you look over 3 months, it's up 17.8%. So what we're seeing is a shift back into the West Coast. That means for a lot of shippers who have diversified and they had their containers coming into Houston, Savannah, New York, New Jersey, now they may be shifting back to LA and Long Beach, which means that a lot of times you're going to have to pay that also additional handling costs of warehousing it over on the West Coast, and then Class 1 rail, and then, of course, your drayage to get the containers back across. These are the water levels for Gatun Lake. Right now it's sitting at 81.6 feet, and the prognosis is not good. Projections actually have it going down to about 80 feet by the end of February. And if you look at the historical trend, we usually see the water levels decrease, but the average mean level is down to about 83 feet. That's usually the lowest you see the lake at. It's at 81 feet right now. So we're talking about historic lows for it. And with no forecast for major rain, that means we expect to see continued delays in and around the Panama Canal. This is going to create more disruptions with the situation we have in and around the Red Sea. That brings us to story number 4, which is the cost associated with all these disruptions we're seeing in and around the Red Sea. Story from Greg Miller over at FreightWaves. While the fallout will be much greater for containers, it won't be as much so far for tankers and bulkers. And as I mentioned to you before, we're not seeing the disruptions in the tanker and bulker market, but we could. And that is a great potential that we need to be aware of. Because if all of a sudden the spate of attacks increase and they start targeting tankers and bulkers, we will definitely start seeing more diversions along those lines. The big issue that's causing the shipping companies to divert has to do with the issue of war risk. And the war risk is still rising. This story from David Osler over at Lloyd's List back on 20 December. So war risk is insurance on top of the normal insurance. Usually you have 2 types of insurance on a ship. You have what's called P&I, which is protection and indemnity. That's the cargo. And then you have hull and machinery, H&M. And that covers the vessel itself. War risk is like flood insurance. It's something that if you don't have that specific protection for, you're not going to be covered by your normal insurance. When the war started and the conflict started, we already had a high-risk area in here, starting with the invasion back on October 7th. You saw all of a sudden that this area got a lot of attention, and the normal war risk insurance to sail through the area was 0.02% of the value of the vessel. Well, as attacks increased, this increased, and we went from zero point zero 0.02 up to about 0.7%. In the Black Sea, you're seeing war risk rates of up to 2.5 to 3%. When you look at historically at something like the Iran-Iraq tanker war of the 1980s, that was almost 5%. So you're paying a good deal of money. You're about $1 million you're paying for a container ship in terms of war risk insurance to go through this area. So it is causing a lot of issues and therefore necessitating some of these diversions around. As they're doing that, the ship charter rates continue to escalate due to Red Sea diversion. So when a lot of shipping companies don't own the vessels they have, they actually charter the ships. And ship charters are a big issue. And one of the things we're seeing is the rate for vessels is increasing because there's more demand because of these longer voyages. If you have to travel 12 to 15% over a longer distance, then you may be needing a ship for more time. And that means you need more ships on that route. And so ship charter rates are going to be increasing. At the same time, you're seeing those surcharges being imposed by companies. Maersk, CMA, CGM are all imposing these extra charges as they go around. We've seen the very first ones going around here, and you see that going on. So you're seeing surcharges here. Maersk said a standard 20-foot container traveling from China to Northern Europe now face total extra charges of $700. Containers bound for the east coast of North America will be charged $500 each. If you've got a ship 10,000 TEU, that's $5 million that of extra surcharges are being incurred and being accumulated by the shipping company. So a lot of money here is being talked about. And these higher freight rates are being used to offset the cost from the Red Sea diversions. Mike Schuller over at G-Captain used this analysis from Fitch Ratings. Fitch sees container shipping as the sector most likely to experience the higher increase, considering 25 to 30% of global shipping volumes rely on the Suez Canal. Come down here a little bit. Fitch estimates that rerouting around Africa, which could increase travel time from the Far East to Europe by 50%, could potentially reduce global shipping capacity by 10 to 15%. Now, fortunately, the shipping companies have invested in huge new construction. 2023 to 2025, we're seeing a whole batch of new container ships come online. When the container companies got flush with cash as a result of the global supply chain crisis, they invested that money in new ship construction. So they were facing the prospect of having too much capacity and lower freight rates. And in a way, the Houthi are doing them a huge favor. Now, of course, we're seeing the flip side of that, where allegations are that the carriers are price gouging and shippers are claiming that the rates are skyrocketing, mainly so that the shipping companies can profit from this. At the same time, the person who's going to pay for this is going to be the consumer. As you see in this piece from Container News, the Red Sea crisis market spike, consumers will pay the price. And then Lodestar comes back, and this is the issue I think we need to be thinking about, is how the box ship owners may actually benefit from the Red Sea and the Suez diversions. As I mentioned to you before, January 1st is the date for renegotiation long-term rates between Europe and Asia. 70% of containers that move on the ocean go under long-term rates. And, the short-term rates are the ones you see spike. Those are the ones where you saw the $25,000 per box limit. And a short-term rate is negotiated typically at the last minute. It's like going to the airport and buying your plane ticket. You may get a deal or you may get screwed. It depends on the deal. You just never know. And long-term rates are the key. January 1 is the Asia to Europe route, and then May is going to be the Asia to North America route. And the question is, how long does this go on, and what impact does this have on overall freight rates? I think that shipping companies, where they're sitting there saying, hey, this is a big issue, we got to solve this and everything, at the same time are probably like, this is not a bad thing to happen right now for our ships to go this longer distance, and we will set up these express routes with this additional coverage provided by the world's navies, and we will charge a premium to go through this area, even though it's actually shorter and costs less. We'll give you that extra premium, but we're going to keep and send our ships around Africa. This is a very unique situation. All right, let's go ahead and look at our last story. So story number 5 is, what else is going on here that is going to impact this? And there are a lot. I mean, this is one of these stories I can do an entire What the Ship on, because the amount of unforeseen and unpredictable factors are probably up there, but let's talk about some of the key ones. Number one, empty boxes will be stuck in all the wrong places for the New Year peak. As you start diverting vessels and ships are not making the scheduled port calls like they want, one of the things that makes containerization work is you have to be able to keep boxes moving. You have to load them, offload them, return them back, and do it all over again. And if all of a sudden you wind up with empty boxes at one site, nobody likes to pay to move an empty box. There's no profit in it. There's nothing. It's a loss. And what we saw, and this happened during the global supply chain, is that empty boxes wound up piling up in LA and Long Beach because ocean carriers were trying to get their ships back faster and they didn't want to wait to load an empty box. And so they left until they were literally mandated to do it. We saw the number of empties in LA and Long Beach increase and they clogged up the yard. This is another factor we may see. We may see empty boxes being a big issue. Now, fortunately, we're coming into Q1, the first quarter of the new year. That's typically the lowest freight moving in terms of containers. You've got the Chinese New Year. You've got a whole batch of factors that are at play here. Golden Week. There's a lot of things going on. And so usually we see the lowest freight during this period of time, which is good. But if ships are altering from their normal routes and not going back to where they need to go, then we're going to see containers piling up. Second, African ports may be overwhelmed by the Red Sea rerouting. Heading to South Africa is a big issue. If you go back to marine traffic, you can see how we're pushing a lot of ships into the southern hemisphere, and I think that's a fairly significant. South Africa is going to find itself extremely busy coming forward. And understand, there have been issues in South Africa prior to this event. There have been strikes and disruptions in the ports down there. The South African infrastructure is not the greatest to handle this large influx that's about to come raining down upon it. And so we can expect to see some issues. Plus, you add 3,500 miles, this is going to involve some ships needing to refuel because ships tend to refuel at major places where the fuel is cheap. And fuel down in Durban is not going to be cheap. This disruption is significant. I should also note, when you look at some geopolitical issues, if you look at the BRICS countries, for example, and BRICS is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. This is a big issue for the BRICS countries because we're seeing a lot of trade heading down in that area. But when you get to the fuel issue, this is a fuel price for Durban, South Africa. So if you look at ports like Singapore or Rotterdam, Houston, or Fujairah, these are major fueling ports. And these are the different types of fuel. This is the high sulfur fuel oil. This is the very low sulfur fuel oil and marine gas oil. You can see where they sit right here, all roughly between $400 to $500 a ton, sitting right there pretty good. But when you get into Durban, well, you're talking about over 600 for high sulfur fuel oil. When you're looking at very low sulfur fuel oil, you're talking about almost 700. And then marine gas oil, you're looking at a jump of over $1,000 per ton that you need. And so fueling in Durban is going to be an issue. It's not going to be just price. It's going to be facilities. Are there sufficient dock space? Is there sufficient bunkering vessels to come out to fuel? Is there enough fuel oil at these sites to handle what's coming in? Because some ships are going to need it. There was a ridiculous story out there about ships running out of fuel and crews abandoning them. That's not true at all. But you may have ships stuck in Durban waiting for fueling, and that is a potential cause. Because once you start rerouting and you go off the normal route, you're going to need to adjust. We see that happen all the time when storms hit and disrupt fuel supply. You also have this story over at Freightways by Eric Kulsich. Cargo owners consider air freight alternatives to Red Sea shipping delays. Now, aircraft cannot handle the volume that's moved by sea. However, if you're on a tight schedule and you have an inventory that is compatible to go on an aircraft, you may want to sit there and say, all right, I'm going to load my stuff on an airplane. I'm going to pay extra money to do that. It's going to be through the nose. But this also creates another thing. How much aircraft freight is available out there? How much capacity is out there? Aviation fuel. There's a finite amount of aviation fuel out there. Is there enough aviation fuel to support an increase in the movement of goods in that way? I'm not an aviation transportation expert, but I'm telling you right now, this is going to be a sector that's going to be impacted because we're going to see that. Same thing with overland rail, especially from Asia to Europe. One of the things that was happening prior to Russia-Ukraine conflict was China was developing an extensive rail network across Asia into Europe. They have still kept that system up, except it doesn't go from Russia into Europe anymore. It basically terminates on the Black Sea, and then it's picked up by Black Sea ships and brought across. Will that continue? Maybe via the India, Iran, Turkey route. There's a lot of alternatives here for moving some cargo. And so I think you're going to see some very unusual ones come up. And then finally, I want to end on this. Peter Sands over at Zentia. And he gave a talk, and it's over in Sea Trade Maritime. Cargo flows through the Red Sea, experts staring at many unknowns. I watched Peter Sands talk, and basically the problem that we're seeing right now is the great what if. We just don't know what else can happen here. If all of a sudden tomorrow the U.S. can get the Houthi to back down, or the Allies can get the Houthi to back down, does the ocean carriers immediately switch back to that route? I don't know. It's an interesting question. It's one I'd love to pose to the CEOs of the major shipping firms. Right now, they're seeing some advantage by going around the Africa route. It's generating revenue for them that they were not having. They're coming off the max profits they've ever had in 2021, 2022. And the forecast for 2024, Zentia, Peter Sands, a few months ago, did a forecast for 2024. It was looking pretty bleak for the container lines. Now it's not looking so bleak right now. And so I think that is a significant issue. However, I'm not exactly sure this situation resolves. The way you solve the problem ashore with the Houthi is you fix the problem in the Mideast with Israel and Palestine. And fixing the Middle East piece, that's the tough one. It's not easy to do. And I don't foresee a big solution coming soon. Instead, what I'm seeing is a suppression of the Houthi right now by the U.S. military. You're going to start seeing some of these allied nations running their nation ships through, the French, the Italians. Interestingly enough, groups you're not seeing in this are the Danes. Where's the Royal Danish Navy? Maersk Lines represents 4% of the GDP of Denmark. Where are they? Germany, Hapag. Where's the German Navy in this? Japan has ships stuck up in here. ONE is stuck up in here. Well, the Japanese will undertake an escort operation to move some ONE ships. Korea, HMM up there. Taiwan, Yangmin, Evergreen. There was an interesting story about Evergreen coming through here. The Evergood, sister ship for the Evergiven. Leave it to Evergreen to have an Everg class ship in it. But the Evergoods was one of the last vessels to go running through here. Very much a hold my beer, watch what I'm going to do. And they ran through there. I should note that Evergreen, before they did that, put on their website a notice that they would no longer haul Israeli goods. And then once the Evergoods got clear, they took it down. So I don't know if that was some Evergreen manipulation there to get their ship out, but they got the Evergoods out, which is always good because you can never count on an Evergreen ship not to get stuck somewhere. But we're seeing a new situation develop. What does this all mean for you? Wow. I'm going to say right now, disruptions and inflation coming your way. I don't see any way about that. I think the movement of crude oil, refined oil, still seems to be moving through here, especially on ships carrying Russian oil. But as oil prices begin to increase, as you go above that price cap, there's a lot of effort right now to prevent the hauling of Russian oil above the price cap. A lot of pressure being exerted. You're seeing containers flow around Africa right now. That's going to cause that disruption, that delay, which means that goods that were scheduled to arrive may come late. You're already seeing the ocean carriers declare force majeure, that it's beyond their hands, so that they can't be fined for that. We're also seeing this express service maybe being initiated through here with the protection of navies. I think the other big thing is the fact of how Operation Prosperity Guardian didn't really coalesce together. And that doesn't bode well for the future. I think that's a big problem. Bruce Jones, in his great book, To Rule the Waves, talks about this issue that we may start seeing the breakdown of the freedom of the seas, the blue ocean that exists, and independent states may become more concerned with protecting their own shipping, even though they may not fly the flag from that nation anymore. ownership and their trade may become very important. You're seeing the U.S. right now moving U.S. flag vessels through this area, largely because there's some DoD cargo involved in this, but also you want to move U.S. flag vessels through it. And again, it's overwhelming force, but that's not going to be there all the time. And the repercussions here going down the road, I think, are significant. If the Houthi can cause 12 to 15% of the world trade to be interdicted, what happens over in the Pacific when you got to go across this big blue ocean here and there are little islands, little spots, and a whole batch of choke points right here to get through the first island chain to get toward your islands and your possessions, especially if you're looking at getting off the coast here of Taiwan and relieving Taiwan in a situation. I think this creates a lot of new problems going forward in terms of ocean shipping. We kind of take for granted the fact that we move 12 billion tons a year across the world's oceans with very little problems. Now we may see those problems. Maybe being under the Panama, Liberian, Marshall Island registry is not as great as people think they are. And maybe it's a good idea to be under an American registry or a European or an Asian registry because they can come get you. I don't know. But we're definitely seeing a reordering of the world's oceans. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. It's a long one, I know, but there's a lot to cover. I'll have this segmented into individual groups so you can take a look at them. But most importantly of all, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, hey, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, give it a big thumbs up, and if you can, support the page. How do you do that? Well, you can hit that super thanks button down below, or you can head on over to Patreon where you can become a monthly or yearly subscriber. I'm not going to issue a surcharge for using this video. I'm not like the big ocean carriers. I'm not going to make you pay more for having to do. If you want to pay, you pay. If you don't want to pay, you don't pay. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Until our next episode, this is Sal signing off. And just real quick, in case I don't get another video in before Christmas, happy holidays to everyone.